Welcome to the Stop Suffering in Silence podcast with your host, Denise Walsh and Rachel Timothy.
Hey, you guys. Big welcome back to Stop Suffering in Silence podcast. My name is Denise Walsh, former clinical psychologist, and we are here with Rachel Timothy. And on this podcast, we do two things. In our nonprofit, as in general, we do two things. We work to educate on trauma and trafficking, as well as empower those who are on the healing journey. And so today we are going to continue the conversation of what's happening in the news regarding Tim Ballard and OUR, because we have some updates for you there. But then also some other news has come out, truly surprising to me, because it's frowning on the legitimacy of victims. And I don't know if these two articles or conversations are related, but it does seem interesting timing. But then we also have a conversation we want to have with you, the audience, about how to support survivors when they're showing you that their house is on fire, in a sense, right? Through negative coping skills. And so stay to the end because we've got some thoughts on that. So Rachel, why don't I start with some of the Tim Ballard updates, and then you can share what you have recently seen about Candace Owens. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that works. And I do just want to share that I think the reason we keep pulling this up and discussing it is because we can learn from all of this. I think sometimes when it's just our own personal neighborhood, our own, we find out so-and-so's a bad guy, and you don't really get to see all the ins and outs of like the victims and I don't know. I just feel like this is a great way for us to learn and to discuss so that it helps us in our own situations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and because it is such a public case with somebody who was loved and trusted by so many, it's got some shock value that we need to process through and try to make some understanding of.
Yeah.
So the new updates with the Tim Ballard case is that there was 2 lawsuits that were filed against him and the OUR board, is what we understand. And the first lawsuit is 5 women. They are remaining anonymous as of now, utilizing potentially their initials or Jane Doe 1, things like that. However, it sounds like, in hearing from the lawyers, that they are preparing to come forward, knowing that if it goes to trial, they will need to come forward and testify and things like that then, but that they potentially could come forward even before then to make their faces known. The reality, of course, as we know, is that this is not easy. Filing a lawsuit, coming forward, none of it is easy. And so the survivors are going through their own healing journey now in a public forum. And as you've probably seen and experienced, even in our own comment section, ridiculed, embarrassed, shamed, judged, hopefully both sides, right? There's some that really do honor and support the victims and come alongside them. And then there's others who point the finger at them and say that they're lying or it's not what they say it was and all that kind of stuff. And so to hear that, number one, the lawsuit has been filed and these girls are banding together, hopefully will give them some strength. And then also to hear that they are gearing up to potentially show their face at some point is hopefully good news for survivors everywhere.
I think it's ridiculous how victims have to be put on trial and almost have to go through a worse process of court than the defense ever has to. The things that they are asked and expected to know or expected to discuss and walk through. I mean, I get that it's all part of the process of learning what really happened, but I just have to feel like there should be a better way. So my heart goes out to them because I know what they're up against and how difficult it's going to be.
The second lawsuit is interesting because it's involving a couple. And so I think that they mentioned that they would, like, the discovery would be similar, the witnesses would be, it would be similar in the terms of a trial, but they are filed separately. And so again, I don't know all the details of that. However, I did just get a 90-page document with all the details of this civil lawsuit and what they're filing. And I do plan to go over that this week to learn more about what the actual accusations are. But the fact that we have at least 7 people who are willing to say, this is not right and something needs to be done, not only for their sake, but for the sake of other women and maybe men, because the couple, I don't know if he specifically was targeted or if it was the breakup of their relationship or things like that, like the damages. But the fact that they're willing to come forward is brave and courageous. And they, most of the time, right, you don't do this for your own sake. You do it because you want to protect others too.
Yes, because it's another trauma. Yeah. But you gotta, your hope is that it'll be worth it because people will understand the truth.
Right. And so this conversation of believing victims, we know that, of course, innocent until proven guilty. And to be honest, you guys, if like the best proof is audio, video, like get it in like black and white as much as possible. If you can, if you're ever in a situation like that, and hopefully these ladies potentially have evidence like that. But the more
my dog's barking too.
Someone's here. But the more hard evidence you have, the better. And that's one of the tricky things about a case like this. But what happens is that sometimes the victim has to prove themselves so much, or they're immediately dismissed. And I think that's a huge fear for why victims don't want to come forward. But then when you hear somebody like Candace Owens starting to seemingly victim shame, it's horrifying. Now, you read the article. I'd love for you to maybe cite the source and share a bit about the article that you read, and we can talk about it.
So I've read a couple different articles, and, they pulled out different quotes, just bits and pieces. And so I wanted to find the actual comment and that Candace Owens made. And so I went to dallasnews.com, and it looks like it was a tweet that she did. And this is what it said. The entire premise of #MeToo is that women are stupid, weak, and inconsequential. Too stupid to know what men might want if you come to their hotel room late at night, too weak to turn around and tell someone not to touch you again, and too inconsequential to realize this. And so I think as I've read more into this, what she's trying to say is if you become a part of this Me Too, it's actually showing that you're too weak to stand up for yourself, too stupid to have known better the situation that you were in, and you're really just kind of following the crowd, that it became a trend to say Me Too, and it is unvalidating those who actually went through sexual assault. And I think I understand what she's trying to say, but I think she's so wrong. I don't get it.
Well, and I would say, like, that's not what Me Too is about at all.
No.
It was not about the victim, in my opinion. It wasn't saying you should have known better. It was giving a platform for survivors everywhere to have a chance to say, yeah, I experienced that, and raise their voice maybe, or raise their hand, have a voice, maybe even for the first time.
Yeah. And I can't help but think back to times when I speak, and it's almost like the Me Too movement gave women 2 simple words that they can utter that shares their story. And so here I am sharing my story on stage, and I cannot tell you how many women come up, give me a hug, and all they say to me is Me Too. That's it. But it speaks volumes. And in that moment, we connect and kind of understand each other. There is no that doesn't make them weak. It doesn't mean they were stupid. Like there's just none of what Candace Owens is discussing here. It's a connection and a simple way for them to express an extremely painful situation they went through and a chance for healing.
Well, and we know that when someone's experiencing trauma, the brokest part of their brain kind of like turns off and you can't speak words. Like literally, it's so hard to get it out. Yes. And so we recommend to survivors to write, to try to like bypass that on some level so they can get out of their system what they're needing to. But the two simple words of me too, or even being able to write that, can start a process of healing that they might not have been able to do before.
It opens a door. And in that moment of them speaking me too and being validated just for those two words without having to know anything else, I think opens the door to maybe it would be safe enough to start sharing what happened.
And that's the thing that ruffled my feathers.
Tell me.
Because it's like somebody finally does the brave thing and then they're victim shamed.
Yes.
Sometimes, not always, of course, but it's so hard to, okay, you'd say most times.
No, what I say is more times than not, you will experience victim shaming. My hope is that you will at least have one or two people that come alongside and say, I believe you. Because I can, like, just thinking of myself and the survivors we work with, all of them have had at least one person in their life shame them for their reality. At least one.
Well, and we talked about this in our group yesterday. When a survivor finally comes forward or peeks their hand up, you know what I mean? Because you're typically giving people the piece, like the tip of the iceberg, seeing how they respond and if they are a safe person to like tell more to. But when somebody says, hey, eek, me too, and then they're judged, they're not going to talk about it again. And the way that you heal is moving through the grief process and allowing for those emotions to come through you, to create new meaning and, you know, and to process through all of that. And so when somebody says, hey, something happened, and then they feel judged, attacked, and shamed, they're not going to start the healing process. And sometimes, as we've seen, it's been decades before they do.
Yeah, I agree. I was trying to learn your thing about writing down what I was thinking, but now I don't know what you said. This is all a learning process.
Well, and I'll just share a quick story. Like I know, I remember, and I may have shared this before, so I apologize if I have on here, but I was a avid Bill Hybels fan. And he led the Willow Creek Leadership Summit, which I watched for every year for almost 10 years. When I lived in Chicago, I went to Willow Creek once or twice. It was kind of far, so we like visited, but I really enjoyed his teaching. In fact, some of what I teach now has come from him and what I learned from him and the books I read from him. But right before he was set to retire, allegations came out. And my first response was, oh, yeah, right. They just want to give him a bad name before he retires. Like, whatever. Like, that was my initial response until I thought, in no way on God's green earth does anyone ever need to feel uncomfortable around their pastor or any man, to be honest. Like, and so, heck no, Bill Hybels, like, you don't get a pass because you are likable or powerful or a leader or whatever. Like, if you make someone feel uncomfortable, that's a problem. And so, yeah, I mean, I understand this initial reaction to want to believe what you've seen for so many years, but in no way should a woman or anyone ever feel violated, uncomfortable, their boundaries crossed, really ever. And so that is never okay, no matter who you are.
Yeah. I know, like, whenever I have started to open eyes to this Tim Ballard thing and what's actually going on, because not everybody knows. They still see Sound of Freedom, like, oh, this is great. They don't know what's going on currently. And so I might mention it, and they'll almost always, the first response or question they say is, Do you believe the allegations? Almost always.
Hmm.
And I want to kind of give you guys this perspective for a second. These women who went on these operations gave up, sacrificed pieces of their life here in America to go over to these countries and do dangerous operations, things that where they would see Satan right in front of their face, hard at work, children destroyed. They went on these operations because they wanted to rescue children. Now, what they endured and experienced then was awful. But you got to also think of it this way. If they cared that much about the children to go on the operations, then you got to also know me coming forward or them coming forward on this would hurt that. I mean, they got to know, like, if I tell the truth about Tim Ballard, this could affect what happens with these kids. And they have to weigh that in their mind because they do care that much. And so it is not likely whatsoever for these women to have just made this up for some reason. There's nothing that is more valuable by doing that than, the truth. And so I don't know. I just take it from the perspective of what are they going to lose in this process? What are they going to gain? And they're telling the truth. Like when you weigh it that way, they're telling the truth.
I with the Candace Owens stuff, for her to say the Me Too movement puts a bad taste of a victim, like in their mouth, if that makes sense, like makes victims look bad in a way. I think part of what she's saying is, can we not be victims and can we be survivors? Like, can we be strong and courageous and all these kinds of things? But I think that's mutually, like, you can do both. You can speak out and tell people what your story, that is brave and courageous. And it is taking your power back and you're not staying in victim mode. I just think she's wrong.
I do too. And I mean, let's share this little piece of information. There was supposed to be an OUR event in Nashville, and we were going to get to be a part of it. And when the accusations came out about Tim Ballard, the whole event was canceled. And I, like, well, hey, why? What is going on? This event was being put on by Candace Owens, and she believes that the way that Tim Ballard's being treated is wrong. And so she canceled the event. And it just makes you,
well, and that's why I'm like, this is not a coincidence that she's saying
No.
these things about victims right now, when she's saying these attacks on Tim are like, she's more mad about that than a survivor coming forward and sharing their story and supporting them.
We have to stop putting people on pedestals and thinking there's no way they could do something wrong. He had a powerful position. He was constantly around this stuff. I mean, it happens. I'm not justifying it, but I'm saying we need to open our eyes to people fall, and we can't be surprised.
So my leisurely reading for the next week will be this 90-page document where I'll dig in and see what happened from their point of view and potentially be able to bring some more information to that to light next week. So in terms of victims, because again, we're saying survivors, victims, sexual assault survivors, like, we want to, telling your story is a powerful and courageous thing to do, and is a part of the healing journey. It just is. Whether you tell it to just your counselor and you shed your onion layers and you heal through the grief cycle through with a counselor and a trusted friend, or whether you decide to speak on stages and write a book, like, telling your story is a part of the process, because we know that stuffing it leads to damage. It damages you. It damages your relationships. It creates negative coping skills, even if you don't realize it. Because again, it's like, everything's fine, but your house is on fire. And so there's just things like, it's not healthy to stuff it. But what happens as soon as somebody raises their hand and then they're silent, it's stuffed. And it takes, again, courage after courage after courage to go to somebody else and say, can I tell you? And can I tell you? And eek, are you safe? And how many people did it take you to find people who finally believed, right?
Yes.
It takes a lot of courage to do that. So in the process, when a survivor is stuffing their story, this is when the negative coping skills come out. Right. This is when cutting, eating disorders, depression, self-harm, anxiety. This is when
alcoholism, drugs, any addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see survivors go from like one end of the spectrum to the other in terms of sexual promiscuity to like gaining a ton of weight because they don't want anybody to see them and they want to hide. I mean, there's a lot of ways that survivors can handle that stuffing, and it comes out in a lot of different ways. But one conversation we had yesterday with our group was the fact that those negative behaviors, stealing, I mean, all these things that are kind of considered acting out potentially, were a cry for help.
Mm-hmm.
And what I thought was really interesting was that these survivors wanted people to notice, and they felt like they were ignored again. So not only could they not voice it, but when they were kind of crying out for help through these negative coping skills, these negative behaviors, they felt like they weren't being heard there either. And so they didn't even have a reason to keep trying.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they internalized it and thinking, well, they obviously don't care. Because as we're talking to our survivors, they're sharing, they had to have noticed I had an eating disorder. They had to have noticed that I was cutting and wearing long sleeves. They had to have noticed that I was, pickpocketing or whatever and stealing. They had to have noticed these things, but they didn't say anything. So then they say to themselves, they obviously don't care that I'm hurting. And they still feel hurt by that, however long later. And they know that these people who saw it loved them. They weren't necessarily saying that that wasn't the case, but at that time when they were crying out in pain with these coping skills and nobody said anything, to them that meant nobody cared.
And so imagine internalizing that and then
Mm-hmm.
living with that belief for a decade.
Exactly. And so I feel like I want supporters to know, like, and we shared this with the girls. It could be that your supporters didn't know what to say. It could be that they felt like if they said something, it would push you away. It could be that it was too uncomfortable for them to face. It could be that they were stuck in their own trauma, that they didn't want to then try to deal with your trauma. It could be a million and one different things. But so often we are afraid to say the truth and face reality with somebody because it steps outside of that comfortableness. And we think that that's what the victim wants. We think they want to stay. They don't want us to say anything. They obviously don't want us to point this out. No, guys, we found last night, every single one of them wanted somebody to notice.
I've got two things to add. One is my friend was going through cancer treatments years ago, and I went to visit her when her husband was out of town, so I could like be supportive. And she was wearing a hat, and all her hair had fallen out, her eyebrows, all this kind of stuff. And we went out to dinner, and she, like the person that came out, didn't hold the door for us, and she was livid. My friend was. She goes, do they not know that I'm a cancer survivor and that I'm going through chemo right now? Like, how dare they, And I thought, I wouldn't know if I just saw you and I didn't know your story. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't have known that wearing a hat meant you had no hair. Like, I wouldn't have known that. And so it reminded me of this because I think sometimes we think everybody does know because it feels so loud to us.
Yeah.
We're thinking about it all the stinking time. Mm-hmm. And so it feels like everybody should know. But the reality is maybe they didn't notice. Maybe they just thought you were a moody teenager. Maybe they didn't know what to say, or maybe they did and you didn't hear them.
Yeah, there's that too.
Because when we were talking last night, I thought, all right, what would these girls really want to hear? And part of me thought, they would want someone to say, how are you? Like, what's going on? But
Yeah.
then I wondered, how would have they responded to that?
Because most likely that would have just very slightly opened a door that then they probably would have responded negatively to you. They probably would have told you, leave me alone. There's nothing going on. I don't want to talk to you. But yet they go back to their bedroom and they think, I wonder if I could tell her. I wonder how she would respond. I wonder if she would still love me. Maybe I could just share a little bit more. And all of those thought processes start going through their mind to where maybe the next conversation they might give I think it's going to be a long journey is my point. Like you can't just expect you to say to a survivor, what's going on? And they're like, oh, let me tell you. Okay, great. You asked. Blah, 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 blah. No.
Finally, let me spill
Yeah.
the beans. Yeah.
No, the protectiveness within them of that secret that they have kept silent about is still going to be there. But yet they want you to keep asking.
Yeah.
And that's got to be exhausting from the supporter standpoint too. Like I acknowledge that.
Yeah. I think that's key is keep asking or
Yes.
potentially even saying, no matter what it is, I love you and I support you. Let me know when you're ready. It could be, and I this is one of my favorite things, right? But just going for a walk or a long drive, it doesn't have to mean it's like Pandora's box and everything comes out at one time, but you're creating the space. I mean, you probably heard or seen like movies with the therapist where they just like sit in silence for a bit
Mm-hmm.
because the goal is to like get used to each other.
Mm-hmm.
When I was working with kids and middle schoolers and teenagers, they weren't going to just give me a story A to Z, tell me how they feel and what they learn now and how they're going to, So we played games. I remember one little boy, I told him, I said, bring your favorite game and teach it to me. And so he came, and for a few weeks, we just played this game together and it broke the ice.
Yeah.
So then during the game, I could say, so tell me what it's like at your dad's house. And again, did you see how I asked that question? I didn't say, is your dad mean? Is he hurting you? And I didn't say it in an accusatory way. I say, tell me more. I'm an open book to learn from you about your experience. And I think there are just ways that we can approach something that is more open than accusatory or, so there are certainly ways survivors can create that conversation. But I think the goal here is to keep asking.
Yeah. I gave a recent 2-day training process to people who are going to be working with survivors. And one of the things I told them is please do not be afraid of awkward silence, because it is in that awkward silence that the survivor's mind is racing with all these things they want to say to you. And maybe in that, they can kind of put it together to where they can speak it. But if you're talking nonstop, they're not going to be able to speak what's going on in their head, because then they're having to process what you're saying and make sense of what's in their head. So don't be afraid of awkward silence. In fact, I usually appreciate it from a survivor standpoint. But also, one of the things that was taught to me in the process of getting help in therapy, like you're talking about, people had the assumption that once you speak it, it's over. And I was told you do not need to go to counseling any more than 3 times. No, I mean, you could do less, but no more than 3 times. Because once you speak it, then you need to never talk about it again. And I think from that perspective, you're not recognizing that it's not just the event itself that causes the trauma. It's the meaning that it gives your soul and your heart and your mind. That you then have to work through as well. And so, yes, here's the event in a summarized way, but there is still so much more to work through.
Well, and let's be honest, the negative coping skills can create additional trauma, micro trauma after micro trauma after micro trauma. So yeah, we're not done yet, because now we want to unravel that those negative coping skills and replant, right, with more positive or healthy coping skills. So when life happens or there's an upset, right, you have the tools in your toolbox, so to speak, that you can handle it better.
Yeah.
Whoever told you that has no idea about psychology.
It does. It makes you feel like, okay, I either don't have enough faith to heal, or something's wrong with me, that I just can't get over this because I did speak it. Why do I have to keep going to therapy? What's wrong with me? And the truth is, nothing. That's normal. There's more to it than just the event itself.
And grief is, and I say grief, and I don't mean that in like a light, like a grief is a process. And so I include the healing process as being the process of moving through grief, because it takes time. It takes years. It takes like it's a process. It's not linear. And so having consistent support through that time is important.
Well, and like you say, too, the onion layers.
Yeah.
Because like we were doing reflecting ownership last night, and I was part of the work that we had was I needed to write down lies that I believed. And it was interesting because 3 months ago, the lies that I believed, I now don't believe. But yet healing those lies with truth, I recognize there's more lies I need to face that I had been believing. And probably when I face these, I'll recognize more, but it's the process of shedding those onion layers to get to the true me.
Yeah. Now, one thing I'll mention too is it seemed like when we were talking last night about the negative coping skills that survivors were exhibiting and hoping somebody noticed, was that if the person or the support person did notice them, they often noticed the negative behavior. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we used to do a lot of, I think about this, we used to do a lot of behavior modification stuff with kids, like reward and consequence and things like that. And most of the time, I would say 90% of the time, the behavior is the fruit of a trauma or an unsafe home or something else happening, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we just do behavior modification to the behavior, we're really not impacting the root. Now, I know that if it's kids and teenagers, it's tricky because they're not necessarily going to tell you everything, but that's why we keep asking. And I think that's where we get to the heart rather than the behavior. And we're speaking to the heart of the person rather than saying, why are you doing X, Y, and Z? You must be a bad person or a bad kid or stop this behavior. Like, let's get to the heart of the matter.
Yeah. And if it's their behavior that's getting your attention, they're going to keep doing the behavior.
Right.
I saw somebody the other day that said, all of you who were the perfect student or like the easily teachable kid, how's therapy going? Because I mean, they were silenced. I mean, they're true, like, I don't know, being able to express what was ever really going, because all kids have struggles, all kids have doubts and insecurities and different things that need to be addressed. And if you were the kid that never had any issues or it's like, how's therapy going now? Because you're probably now trying to voice what went on as a kid.
That's funny. All right. So to wrap this up, I think the moral of this episode is dramatic pause while the dogs bark. Is to believe survivors. Mm-hmm. Even if you don't, I don't want to say that people are, they're guilty until proven innocent. No, I'm not saying that you need to, but honor the story that you're being told, because it took a lot of stinking courage for them to get there. And if you're seeing these negative coping skill behaviors, I think the only thing you can control, and you may have something to add here too, but is to continually say, I love you, I support you, and I want to know how you're really doing. Mm-hmm. And try to create that space as much as possible.
Yes. And I want to speak out to the survivors just to say, you will find that there's not always going to be people who believe you, that they will shame you for this, like this Me Too stuff with Candace Owens. And unfortunately, it's going to happen. And I think it says more about them than it says about you. But I also believe that if you keep trying and keep speaking your truth and your story, there will be people that come alongside you and say, that was not okay, and we want to help. So don't quit saying me too, because I think it matters.
And then I'll piggyback off of that and say, keep your eyes and heart open to the people who are saying, how are you? What's going on? How can I help? Because I wonder if sometimes we just miss it because we're so stuck in our own stuff that maybe people are asking and are seeing, but yet we're kind of letting it pass by. So give them at least a little, so a supporter can actually support you.
I agree wholeheartedly. Well,
I just love our conversation. So I hope other people do too. If you enjoy these conversations and processing through trauma and trafficking and what it does to our body and to our communities and how to shift through that, like this podcast, like this video, subscribe, all the YouTube things, and post your comments, your thoughts in the comments below, because this isn't just Rachel and I sharing our thoughts, wisdom, experience, etc. We want to hear from you. This is a community of survivors and supporters who are all on the healing journey together. So we'd love to hear your insight as well. In case you missed it, we did post in the last video. We had an opportunity in Nashville to record like a professional promotional video to share exactly what Stop SIS is all about. And it was a really kind of God moment about how that even came to fruition. And then it was so much fun. We hope to continue going back and creating educational materials for schools and nurses. So anyway, lots of fun things happening. We're in the middle of reflecting ownership. We also are launching a survivor book here in the next month. So please stay tuned to that as well. We have 10 ladies who are sharing a piece of their story in our upcoming survivor chapter book, which will be really empowering for them and hopefully inspiring for you.
Yep. And we will be in the Charlotte area the end of this month. And so if you're interested in hearing us speak, and we'd love to have you.
Yeah, it's a free women's event. So Rachel gets a chance to share her story, but there's going to be lots of other inspiration and growth focused activities there, reconnecting with the Holy Spirit and creating that space we all just need every once in a while. So we'll put the link to that in the show notes below as well. But with that, have an awesome day, you guys. Thanks for being here, and we will see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to this powerful episode of Stop Suffering in Silence. If you are interested in booking Rachel to speak at your school, your church, or on your podcast, then please email openblindeyes@protonmail.com. If you are interested in sponsoring a survivor on their healing journey and would like to donate to Stop SIS, then please check out the link in the description box or show notes below, or you can email stopsis@protonmail.com. And finally, if you are currently suffering in silence, or you know somebody who is, whether they're dealing with a current trauma or one from the past, then we will always recommend that you reach out to your local resources and find a counselor that you can trust, because nobody is meant to suffer alone. Have an amazing week, and thank you for being here.